baby.
So I'm Renee Darvin, and I'm the child of immigrant parents, first generation American. So nobody in my family was ever interested in art, to this day as a matter of fact. I was always a little bit offbeat. They never quite knew what to do with me because I was interested in art, because I always drew. I remember the main occupation I had when I was a child was we would play with paper dolls. If you're young now, you don't know what paper dolls are. But you'd buy a book with paper dolls and a whole wardrobe of clothes, and you put these dolls through a whole variety of activities. But somehow the clothes the dolls wore never were satisfactory to me. So I would make tons of paper clothes for the paper dolls. And that kept me drawing and coloring, and I filled coloring books and stuff like that. I had two younger sisters. I have two younger sisters. They were very pesty when they were younger. Now they're not so pesty. And we're good friends, but they got in my way all the time. They messed with my things, they played with my toys, they wore my clothes. And I would come home from school, from elementary school, and I would do whatever I could to get away from them. Because if I was home with them, I had to take care of them. My mother worked, I was the eldest, and my mother worked very hard in the house, had a very hard life. She was a full-time mom. That was what they were in those days. They didn't call them that, but she was home with the kids. And we always lived on a third floor walk up, and she cooked everything from scratch, and no washing machines, and all that stuff. So if I was home, it was chores and my sisters, particularly my next in line sister. And so I would do what I could to escape. I'd come home from school. We lived 3 blocks from school. I'd run home, change my clothes, and we lived a few blocks from the Brooklyn Children's Museum. And I would go to the Brooklyn Children's Museum for an hour and a half until it closed at 5. And you could bring a penny or 2 cents to the museum, and you could buy what amounts to a Xerox of flowers, and then a picture of the flowers in full color. Or birds, that was like a coloring book of the birds, and then the full color picture of the birds. They'd give you colored pencils, and you could sit and color the pictures. I can still tell you what a trailing arbutus looks like, because I colored it so many times. And you could make maps out of plaster of Paris. You made relief maps. It was quite wonderful, and it was a haven for me. And I was maybe in 2nd or 3rd grade, and I would be able to go there by myself and spend the afternoon till it was time to go home and have dinner. I also stretched the other way. We lived in Brooklyn on Kingston Avenue, on the subway station, the Kingston Avenue subway station. And you could take that subway to the Brooklyn Museum. There was a Brooklyn Museum station. And it was about 5 or 6 stops. And I can confess now that I used to sneak under the turnstile, get on the train, and go to the Brooklyn Museum, which was empty. People were just not in the Brooklyn Museum, or in any museum at that time. It was a time when people just didn't go to museums, and museums didn't seek them out either, the way they do now. It's a whole different world. So I go into the Brooklyn Museum. Nobody thought to stop an elementary school child alone. And I find my way to the Hall of the American Indian, those giant totem poles, the large canoes, the weavings. I'd be all alone in those rooms. They were half dark, and I could make up all my fantasies about that. It was wonderful. So very early in my life, I sort of found my niche in a museum. It was a haven. It was a place where I saw things nobody else I knew saw, and it was my special place. Of course, I once got caught by my aunt in the subway alone, and she looked around and asked where my mother was, and when I said she was home, my aunt said, "And you're here alone?" And I did get smacked when I got home, but for being on the subway, I promised never to do it again, but I did. So that was the beginning for me, that there was something outside of my family, something that could belong just to me, that was very important to me in growing up. in elementary school, my best friend was also very interested in art, and we were the class artists. We made all the school posters, we made murals. I couldn't draw hands. We would get somebody else to come in to draw the hands. We had a special hand artist in the school. But it was an 8th grade school, and we reigned supreme. We were the class artists. And I had a very strange experience with my 8th grade teacher who was preparing us for high school. She was a bitter old woman, very mean, didn't like us. I think probably there was some sort of anti-Semitism operative. It was post-World War II. Well, World War II, she was German, we were Jewish, whatever it was, she didn't like us. And when it came time to choose a high school, I knew I wanted to study art. And she was supposed to tell us about it, the art schools that were available for it. She never told us, my friend Carol or I. And this probably needs some editing. But anyway, I didn't know there was a school called the High School of Music and Art. My family didn't know. Nobody knew anything about that. They were struggling to be alive. But I found out about music and art from one of the students in the other 8th grade classes who had been accepted to music and art for music. And she said to me, "How come you didn't apply to music and art?" And I said, "What's music and art?" And so I went to Miss Keller, my 8th grade teacher, my art teacher. And I said, "Miss Keller, is there a school called Music and Art?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "You didn't tell us about it." She said, "Do you know what you have to do to get into music and art?" And I said, "No." She said, "You have to have a portfolio." "Do you have a portfolio?" This is my art teacher. And I said, "No." So she says, "Do you know what's in a portfolio?" I said, "No." She said, "Charcoal sketches. Did you ever work in charcoal?" And I said, "No." She said, "How could you go to music and art?" So I said, "Thank you, Miss Keller," and I went home. And I went to Washington Irving High School, where I took 4 periods of art a day, and I met the woman who changed my life. So, and that was a woman called Julia Winston, and she was my art teacher, and she was everything that Emma Keller was not, and she provided the validation for my interests, and everybody in my class was an artist. It was an all-girls school, and we were this community of artists, and it was quite wonderful. Girls came from all over the city to take that course. Those that didn't go to music and art, of course. Anyway, Julia Winston was unique in the way she taught in a way that probably we wouldn't admire today. Whatever you did was never quite enough. You could do more. But it spurred me on in some way. And in that way, she was like my mother. My mother was never quite satisfied either. But Julia Winston was that way. And I remember I was editor-in-chief of the high school yearbook. And she was in charge of the high school yearbook. And when I announced to her that I was editor-in-chief, she looked at me and she said, "Well, you'll be good," she said. "But Rachel last year, she was great." So for everything I did that whole senior year was always good, but Rachel's was better. Until I graduated, and I gave her my yearbook to sign. And in the yearbook, she signed it, and she wrote, "To Renee, who turned out better than Rachel." And I have that book, of course, to this day. But she was wonderful. And I kept a relationship with her after I graduated. I brought her my baby to see, and I remember just turning up the nerve of me one day. I just turned up at her front door with my husband and child, without even calling her first. But we just, and then I had the chance, long after when I became an art teacher, to take a professional day. By that time she had changed schools and she was now teaching at Music and Art. And I had a chance to take a professional day, and I went to visit her. And I told her how much she had meant to me. I had that chance, and I would urge everybody who has that chance to do that, because it not only meant a great deal to me, but certainly to her as well. And I went to school, and she was smaller than I remembered her, but she was the same person. As I walked into the room, she was in the middle of a presentation, and she stopped dead in the middle, and she said, "Girls," it was an all-girls class, "Girls, I want you to meet this young woman." Went on, and I stood there and I nodded to all these teenage girls, and I had left my own class to take this day. And it was a really very special time. I'm glad I did it because she died soon after that. She made a trip to China and caught some sort of a respiratory disease and died. Otherwise, she'd still be around because she was the most vigorous, enthusiastic, extraordinary person whose whole life with her husband was art. He was an artist, and they had calligraphy on their walls, and they were just very special people. And she changed my life. So I was in high school, and what was I going to do after high school? Well, I knew I was interested in art, and we still had no family money or anything like that. And where was I going to go to school? Well, I was either going to go to Brooklyn College, which was free, or Brooklyn College at that time was free. Well, where could I go to college? I was an excellent student in school. I think I had the highest average in the class when we graduated, but I was interested in art. So Mrs. Winston suggested I apply to Cooper Union, which I had really never heard of. I mean, I heard nothing. I lived this cloistered life practically in the heart of Brooklyn, and I applied to Cooper Union, and I was accepted. And at that time, I think there were 1,200 people who applied, and they accepted 60 students. Now, I was not the best artist in the class. I was not the best artist, but I was the best student, and I think that's what Cooper was looking for. They said sometime later on, in another instance, that they were interested in people who were teachable, and that they would teach us. And they taught me, and that was another life-changing experience. It took me out of my world. It took me out of Brooklyn in a way that going to high school in Manhattan never did, although it did advance me. For the first time, I had friends who were not Brooklyn Jewish girls, whose parents were overprotective and stuff like that. For the first time, I met other people. And Cooper did that on a much grander scale. And it was really very special. And I was going to be a painter. I didn't think I was a great painter. I didn't think anyone was ever going to be interested in my work, but it was something that I was going to do. I didn't take an advertising course. I was just going to paint. Of course, I married my first year of Cooper Union. Put a little crimper on my plan because somebody had to make a living. As was likely in those days. I was married about 2 years when it seemed the right time to start to have a family. So I hadn't yet graduated when we were talking about that. It was a 3-year course at Cooper Union at the time. You got a diploma and not a degree. And those students who could afford it in time or in money, transferred their credits to Yale for a year and a summer and got an MFA, a BFA, or I got a diploma when I graduated. Everybody did. But some went on, or they went to NYU, and they got a BFA, a year and a summer or two. But I was already married, and I was planning motherhood, so I couldn't do that. So I went to Brooklyn College at night. I was having a child. I was pregnant at the time, and I'm going to have a child, and didn't see myself sitting on the bench talking diapers and formula with all the other ladies who lived in my city project that we lived in. And so I went to school at night. I went to Brooklyn College at night. It took me 5 years to get my degree, and that's an interesting thing too, because when I went to Brooklyn College, I went there as if I was doing them a favor. I was bringing the greatness of Cooper Union to their humble school, and they couldn't have been less impressed. which was an interesting growing up experience for me. At any rate, I went to Brooklyn College, and although I had graduated with some 96 state-approved credits in art, Brooklyn College's art department at that time only had 40 some odd credits. They gave me credit for the 45 credits, but they said, so I became a lower sophomore at Brooklyn College at night after 3 years during the day. But you know, I didn't care because I was mothering, and I was going to be a painter. So I didn't care how long it took me. And it kept the little gray cells going to go to Brooklyn College at night. There's another interesting thing there that I think is an object lesson. Brooklyn College had a rule that said you had to take your major subject in residence. A lot of schools have that. But I had taken my major subject somewhere else. So they looked at my record, my transcript, and they said, "Oh, you're a good student. Become an English major." And I said, "It'll take me 10 years to get a degree if I do that." I said, "I can't do that." So I made an appointment to see the registrar, and he looked at my record, and he said to me, "Do you have a safety deposit box?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, get one, because I'm going to write a letter." He said, "And someday somebody's going to tell you that you don't have the right requirements to graduate." And he wrote a letter giving me permission to major in secondary education and minor in art. No, wait a minute. He gave me a credit to major, yeah, that's exactly it. Because the rule was that you majored in your field and you minored in art. He gave me permission to do it the other way. And I took out a safety deposit box, and I put the letter in the safety deposit box. And in my senior year, finally, at Brooklyn College, after 5 years, I got a letter from the then registrar, new registrar, saying I had failed to meet major requirements and I could not graduate. And I went to the safety deposit box, took out my letter, and I was the only person to ever graduate from Brooklyn College at that time. I don't know who followed me, who could minor in their major field and major in secondary ed. And so I got a bachelor's. And by that time I was like on my second child. I have 3. And I decided I might as well go for a master's because I enjoyed school so much. So I went for a master's. I stayed at Brooklyn. It was home and close and a good place to be. And I was about to have my 3rd child. All of my children went to Brooklyn College in utero. They all did. I dissected fetal pigs with them in my abdomen, and all kinds of other stuff. Anyway, so that was Brooklyn College. And through all of this time, as I said, my family didn't quite know what to do with me. Because was I still going to school? Didn't she graduate? I thought she graduated. She graduated twice. Is she still going to school? They'd never been to college. I was the first person in my family to go to college. They'd never been to college. Certainly weren't interested in art. She's going to be a painter, that kind of thing. And my mother came to visit me one day. We lived in Canarsie at the time. She used to take 3 buses to come to visit me. And we didn't have a car. So she came to visit me and told me that she met an old friend of hers on the bus. And you know what her friend was doing? Her friend went to visit her daughter-in-law. Do you know what her daughter-in-law was doing? No. Her daughter-in-law was going teaching one day a week. My mother said to me, "You've been going to school for so long. Maybe you should go teaching one day a week." And I said to her, "But Mom, I don't have a license." And my mother said to me, "So get one." So I did. And that's how I became an art teacher. Just as casual as that. I went down to the Board of Ed and I took the exam, which was dreadful. It was a 2-day exam. One day you wrote, the other day you brought in all your papers and your paints and your portfolios, and you created artworks for one day. And I was in my 2nd month of my last pregnancy at that time, and I had to take the subway and come home in rush hour, and I was pukey, and it was a nightmare. And what do I need this for? I have 3 kids. I'm going to have 3 kids. And but I did it, and I got my license. Oh, I had my license. My mother was still coming to visit me, meeting her friends on the bus. So what was I to do with this? So I called the schools that I could get to by bus, and I registered as a per diem sub. And they would call me. 2 schools in particular called me. And they would call me, say 6:30 in the morning. And they would say, Mrs. Darvin, are you available today? And I would say, I'll have to call you back. And I would call my mother, and I would say, Mom, the school called me today, can you come? And I would listen to a litany of what she was going to do that day. She was going to get a haircut, she was going to go shopping, she was promised to visit this person, she had this appointment, but she would come. She always came. I would call the school back. I would tell them I'd be there. I had afternoon session because school was very overcrowded then. And I would go to school and be a per diem sub. So I had never been in front of a class in my life. I had never done student teaching. I did student teaching in some community center to find, because I had kids. I wasn't about to go anywhere. And I didn't know any teachers, no one in my family. I had no idea what to do in a classroom. What do you do when you go into a room? I remembered, but nobody had ever really instructed me. I had all this theory of Brooklyn College. So I spoke to a friend of mine whose brother-in-law was an art teacher. And I said, do you think he'd speak to me and tell me what to do the first time I'm in front of the class? And she said, sure. So I went over to his house that night before I used to go to school, and walk into this room. Never met this guy before. I said, what do I do when I walk into a room? I didn't even know that. And he said to me, this is my famous story. You can ask Mary Hafley about this. He looked at me and he said, issue a command. I said, what? He said, walk into the room and say, that boy, open the window. And I said, my jaw dropped. And I said, what if the window's open? That boy, close the window. Well, Pam, it worked. And I must tell you that I tell all my student teachers about this to this day, because it was an amazing moment. I walked into the room for the first time. I couldn't catch my breath. I was so nervous. My heart was pounding away, and the kids were milling around. Nobody was seated in their seats. The class was chaos. I walked into the room, looked around, and I said, that boy, open the window, please. And the class got quiet, the window got open, and everybody sat down, and I just began talking. That's how I began to teach. That's my first day in the classroom. So of course, as a per diem sub, you didn't teach art. But we sort of caught on in that school, and I survived. And then they offered me, an art teacher in the department was going to have surgery over the Christmas vacation. And he was going to be out 2 weeks before Christmas and 2 weeks after Christmas. Would I take his class? An art teacher. And I said, oh, I can't do that. I have young children. I had a new baby. So he said, well, why don't you ask your mother? Because they knew already that I couldn't take a per diem job without checking with my mother. And I called my mother up and I spoke to her. And her answer was, well, you say it's like babysitting when you do per diem work. She said, now you'll know if you really like teaching. And that woman came over every day, 2 weeks before Christmas, 2 weeks after Christmas, and I was hooked. That was my world. This is what I knew I wanted to do. I loved every minute of it. And it worked out well because they offered me a full-time job for the next semester. And my first response was, oh, I couldn't do that. I have young children. And they said, well, why don't you talk it over? So I came home and I spoke to my husband. I figured if he scotched it right then and there, it'd be the end of it, maybe. But I would see. And he said, well, your mother's been threatening to find a job. She can't find a job. She always wanted to go back to work. She had last worked when I was born, before I was born, and she had a semi-managerial job in a factory. So she thought, she was going to go back as a manager. She had absolutely no skills for business, and never got a job. Never went for a job. So in my own mind, I said, what does she do well? She raises family, you know? If she'll come and take care of my children, I will give her part of my salary, and then we'll both have jobs. And I put it to her, and she said yes. And she came over every day for that 6-month period. And it was really too much for her. I would come home and she had her hat on. So that was my first sign that it was too much for her. Of course, my ironing was done, my supper was on the stove, the kids had already been fed, I had late session, I got home after 5. My house was immaculate, and sometimes my father met her there also, and they went home together, still by bus and stuff like that. And but I knew it was too much for her, and at the same time, and I gave her part of my check every month when I got paid, which she accepted, and I just felt that this was the way it was going to work out. But it was too much for her, and I would have to find make some other end, because by that time I was hooked. I knew this is what I wanted to do. My kids, because of this easy transition with grandma coming first once a week, twice a week, it just was an easy thing for them to ease into. They certainly didn't miss me. And so I had that time, I had a woman who cleaned once every other week, and we loved her, and I asked her if she'd come every day, and she was thrilled to have that kind of a job, and so she came, and my mother lost her job, and I'll tell you a sidebar of that. It's not an educational story, but we were living in 4 rooms in a project with 3 kids, and we needed something larger for us. And I told my mother that we were hoping to buy a house, but we really didn't have enough money for a down payment. And at that point, she said, "You have more money than you think you have." And she presented me with a bank book. She had taken all the money I gave her and put it in a separate account and gave it to me. And we bought a house, our first little house. And we bought a house. So if I'm a teacher, it's because my mother invested in me in ways that are unbelievable to imagine, and believed in the fact that I could do this. She never understood what I was doing, of course, but she did take great pride in it, as did my father, and that's how I became an art teacher. It just sort of rolled into it, but from the very first, it was my world, and I knew I loved it. And I spent my teaching career in 2 high schools in the city, New York City. So I was an art teacher, a high school art teacher in Tilden High School in Brooklyn. And because I didn't know how to teach, really, I kind of made it up, and I taught them what I had learned in Cooper. So we had a very high level of expectations for the kids, and they did extraordinary work. There was a brand press that was in my art room that nobody had ever used, and I started printmaking with the kids, and it was just, and I was in charge of the stage for 5 years, which was, that was amazing. I was called to the office of the principal one day, and my appointment to the school was coming up, and he put his arm on my shoulder, and he said, "Renee, we'd like you to be in charge of the stage." And I went, "But Mr. Marley's, I don't know anything about stage. The only stage that I've ever done has been in a shoebox. I don't know anything about it. I'm afraid of electricity." And he clapped me on the shoulder and he said, "Renee, we know you'll do a wonderful job." And I spent 5 wonderful years in charge of the stage, and we did the most amazing productions. And I had a crew of kids that worked with me that were magic. It was one of the best experiences of my life. And when the chair of the department left, he named me department chair, which did cause a union grievance because I was the youngest and the newest in the department, but it prevailed, and I was the chair of the department. And then, after being in that school, working there for about 13 years or so, lots of friends, very happy, my cousin, who was helping to build a new school in the Rockaways, he was a science chair, and somebody had the inspired idea that if they were going to build a new school in the Rockaways, wouldn't it be nice if it was on Jamaica Bay? And wouldn't it be even nicer if the school's specialty was marine biology? And wouldn't it be nice if they could make use of the natural setting for the school? And he was all excited about it. He was helping them design the school. He was just a teacher at the time, but he was going to be working.
Wisdom.
Okay, when I came to Teachers College, the second assignment I had after my museum class, my museum classes, was to supervise the student teachers. And that opened a whole new avenue for me. It was wonderful because it got me back into the classrooms I had sadly missed, and brought me back with young people and with beginning teachers who were so full of, hope and anticipation, and gave me a whole new audience for the things that I wanted to say. I guess I always taught teachers because I was the chair of a department for a long time, certainly for at least 15, 16 years before I became director of art. And I always had kind of a notion in my mind as to how the kids should be treated and how important art was in people's lives, and how it was the art teacher's task to open that world to kids who had not experienced it before. So perhaps I never articulated it as such, but it was always part of my consciousness. So when I worked with teachers that I hired or teachers that I inherited, it was always, well, this is one way of doing it, or I like to try it this way, or to help them if they needed something. And we had a very interesting program in the second high school I was in that it was an all-elective program. And this all-elective program meant we had 10-week cycles, and so kids would try a subject in art for 10 weeks and not feel threatened by it and feel married to it, and they could try something they always wanted to do, maybe photography, maybe drawing, maybe architecture even, art history. And sometimes we would capture those kids with real interest and real talent and direct them to go on with it, and they built very important parts of their lives at it. We had a number of kids. I had a portfolio class every year that had 20 or more students in it, that was in a neighborhood high school in the edge of Rockaway. Kids who had not been to Manhattan, but knew enough about art, had enough art experiences in school to know they wanted to know something more. So I guess I always taught teachers in a sort of casual way. But when I got to Teachers College, suddenly I had to put it all into writing and plan and decide the progression and the sequence, and it put me off a little bit. But the students at Teachers College were and are wonderful. They come from all over the world. They are bright, and there's a certain energy about them that I've always liked. There are no cliques. It's a very special world up there. And I was fortunate because student teaching was the very last thing they ever did. So I inherited all of these wonderfully bright, exciting students who'd already been well schooled in pedagogy and theory and artistic development. They had all of that in them, and it just meant it was my task then to get them ready to transition into a classroom. And they look forward to the opportunity to be in a classroom, and many with great excitement. And I would meet them on the very first day. I'm sorry, I don't remember what I said. Anyway, so I'd get all these wonderful students, and I would transition them. And it seemed logical, since I was the one in the program that had the most recent full-time school experience, that I share my experiences with them. So even though I had a script for the plan for the evening, if I was led astray by somebody's question about something that happened in the class they were working in, I went down that road very willingly and talked about how I would have done it, how I saw it done, what I knew to be so, and it just evolved, so that I guess a lot of my teaching practice is a retelling of the stories of my own life, because I've always learned something about myself and about the kids and about art by seeing it in the classroom setting. So I know how powerful that can be. And I meet the student teachers first, and I tell them, I make sure they understand that it's very hard work, that this is not going to be, as I was told, an easy job for a woman, because after all, you have the days off when your kids are off from school. Somebody actually told me that, and maybe it was my mother. Anyway, but that it's hard work. It's hard work, and that if you don't love making art, and if you don't like being around kids, I don't say you have to love kids. You may not even know you love them yet, but the idea is that if you don't want to share your experiences, your joys, your problems, your difficulties with someone, then don't be an art teacher. And I tell them there are enough bad art teachers now, and don't be an art teacher. Find some other line of work, because that's what you're going to have to do. You're going to have to work hard, and you're going to have to love art, and you're going to have to love the kids, and even the ones you don't think ever going to love, because it's such a dynamic learning experience every day. You can't possibly plan your day and know how it's going to turn out. Something always pops up, and you have to rise to it in a minute, and you have to be prepared for it, so that you can't say, oh, just a minute, I'll think about how to resolve that. You have to be there and respond. So, and it comes out of the things you've experienced. So it's important that they be very sensitive, that new teachers be very sensitive to their environment, to not, they are, after all, guests in the cooperating teachers' room. They're not there to instruct the cooperating teachers. Many of them think they are. They're full of theory. I always love that about student teachers, by the way, that they're so full of all this knowledge they've acquired. It was just, let me at those kids because I know it's good for them. And then they realize that that's not their role there. They're there to see how the class runs, to learn some tricks of the trade, to learn some responses, because they won't be their own person in charge of a class until they're confronted with their own class, and until some time has passed and they've had a chance to work out some bugs. And I always tell them, it's not brain surgery. If you make a mistake in something you do, that nobody dies, that you get another chance. But you have to think about it. You have to be reflective. You have to run that TV camera in your brain at the end of the day and say, what happened? Why did I do that? How did she say that? Why did she say that? How could I have done it differently? In some way, just replay the day so that you think about what you've done. It's not mindless. It is every day a learning experience. And the next day, when something similar happens, you've got that behind you and you can put it into play, and you'll recognize what makes it different from what happened the day before. Only you will recognize it. Nobody has to tell you that, because you're soon going to be very, very alone in your room, and you won't have anybody to fall back on. In a weekly seminar in a class, we can hash out all these problems you entertain, but it's a rare art teacher that can share this with somebody else. You kind of have to find your own ground. So you have to be pretty sure of yourself, even if you don't feel that way. And that is that you bring something to the classroom. What do you bring? What kind of technical skills? What kind of empathetic skills? What kind of understandings of what children can do at certain ages? What children want to do? What's of interest to them? All of these things that you have to bring to the situation before you tell the kids, we're going to do a landscape or a neighborhood scene or anything like that. And it really comes out of dialogue. You get to know the kids by engaging in the dialogue, by talking to them. And I know in public schools, very few kids are experienced in dialogue, and nobody's ever listened to them. And it's very hard to get kids to talk about their feelings and themselves and their lives if nobody's ever asked them that before. You go into a private school class and you can't stop these kids from talking, because people have been listening to them since kindergarten or before and think they have weighty things to say. But in a class of 30 kids from an urban school district, Nobody's ever asked them what they think, and they forget how to think, or they never really develop that skill. So that's your job also, to get the kids to look inside themselves and find out who they are, and to bring that out. And I hope that in the way we conduct our classes, that we encourage that kind of behavior. Not only reflection of what you do as a teacher, but also reflection of encouraging the kids to reflect on what they do. So that's a big part of what we do in our program anyway. Also, we require that our student teachers work at each level, at secondary as well as elementary. When I first came to Teachers College, they only took 1 semester of student teaching. And I would say to them, bright-eyed, excitedly, so what age level resonates with you? And they'd say, oh, I love little kids, or I hate little kids. And I would place them accordingly, where they wanted to be. And then we found out, well, they had never worked in a high school, they'd never been inside of a high school, so they didn't get the high school job they really wanted, so they were disadvantaged. So I went to Judy Burton and I said, we have to do something about this. So we invented what we call the Maxi and the Mini. So they took, for 10 weeks, they took the age level that resonated with them, and then for 5 weeks they took the other age. And then they would come back to me, streaming back to me. I didn't know I love those little kids, and those high school kids are so wonderful, and I used to be afraid of them, and now I love them, and I'm just getting to know them, and now I have to leave. So I went back to Judy again. I said, Judy, they need to have both levels. And even then they may not know, but at least they will have tasted it. And Judy thought that was a great idea. She's always been very supportive that way. And lo and behold, now our students are required to take a semester at elementary and a semester at secondary. So at least they know where they are most comfortable, and they've had that kind of experience. And they go every day, and they spend the full day in the school. So they really have a semester, and they take nothing else while they take the student teaching experience. So they really can immerse themselves in the culture of the school they're assigned to. And I try very hard to assign students to schools where I think they will fit in. That process takes me way too much time to put the round pegs in the round holes, etc. But it's all worked out very well. And the students are eager to start, and by the time they take the second semester, they're so ready to teach that some of them have to be reminded that they're still student teachers. But they're just so ready to engage with the kids. Also, we say that in our program, that in order to be an art teacher, you have to study art. So we foster that idea that as part of your master's degree, you have to take studio classes. And I know that has been a great part of my life too. Although my reasons were maybe never so articulated, I always felt the need to know what everybody else was doing, to know it in myself, not just to know about it. So that when we had an all-elective program, I, as a department chair, as the assistant principal in charge of the department, I began this frenzy of taking classes in everything from ceramics and weaving and metalworking, because how could I supervise a teacher who was teaching this if I had never experienced it before? And I got captured very often in doing the kind of artwork that I was learning about as yet another way. And one example is the time I studied cloisonne and metalwork, because a teacher who had promised to come and teach 3 classes of kids never showed up. And I wasn't going to lose those kids to the program. 3 classes of kids were too precious. So I learned how to do it myself, and I taught them. And there I was, after years being a painter who couldn't paint large enough or with a fat enough brush, suddenly working on something the size of a dime with a 000 sable brush. What an experience that was for me in my own artistic development, to be able to experience that shift, which I never would have done otherwise. So I did life drawing and stuff like that while I was teaching, and it kind of kept the gray cells going and the fingers going as well. So that's been a very important part of this, of my work, and I feel quite honestly that my time in museums was very important for that too, because I constantly encountered the work of great artists. And the interesting thing about this, I don't think I've ever been to a museum, ever, that I didn't want to go home and make that or do that. I always said, I could do that, or I should do that, or couldn't I, shouldn't I? I always get that feeling you get in the back of your teeth, that you want to be doing it also when you go. And then if you didn't do it, why didn't you do it? So I think the teachers, I encourage my teachers to go to museums. We always have at least 1 or 2 lessons in the weekly seminar that deal with museums. Museums in New York City have open houses for educators. We always take a class night and go to that open house as a group and then talk about it afterwards. Of course, our students have already taken a museum course because that's required. So that adds to their experience with this. I can't imagine not having your students, and that includes my students and their students, experience real art. I remember how shocked I was the first time I saw a Henry Moore sculpture that I thought was this big that turned out to be room size, or vice versa. And I remember on my first trip to Europe, when I saw the things that I'd been teaching from 3x4 pictures in textbooks in the flesh, and came eye to eye with David's ankle, and how that made me feel. How can we not want our students to experience the same thing? And how is not their understanding of art and the artistic process enriched by that kind of contact, that kind of meeting, which nothing can replace? So we're lucky in New York that we have this, but there isn't a community in this country that doesn't have some repository of original works of art that are so important for kids to experience on that level, this collection of work that is a resource for what goes on in the classroom. So you have to make art, you have to love art, art has to be part of your life. I think the process itself of making art makes you a better art teacher. I meet a lot of people who think they can teach art because they like art, but I think unless they have put a brush to a canvas and had the canvas give a little bit as they put the pressure on the brush, then they don't know what painting really is. Until they've not quite wiped the plate clean and gotten a messy print, they really don't understand what goes into making something. And that's something we all share, those of us that are products of art experiences like that. We've made it, we've done it. Maybe we don't do it as much as we want to, but it's now part of our pattern, and we never forget it. And when we see somebody else trying it, whether that kid's in 2nd grade or that kid's in high school, there's a connection that I was once in that spot. And I hope art teachers never lose that. So.